Hello, this is Ruslan Belov. You are watching another daily overview of the situation on the Ukrainian front. You have probably seen yesterday's Christmas address by Zelensky, in which he allowed himself to wish the Russian president a swift death. In reality, he does not even realize that Putin is, in fact, a stroke of luck for them. Because if someone else were in his place, even just a little more hard line, no one would have stood on ceremony long ago, and many cities would already be nothing but ruins. I know that viewers from many different countries watch our channel. Therefore, I would like to sincerely congratulate everyone who is celebrating Christmas today, December 25th, on this bright and kind holiday. The fighting on the front line continues, and we continue to carefully analyze everything that is happening. So friends, some of you may experience a sense of déjà vu today, because once again we are starting this episode with the same sector of the front as yesterday. But before that, I want to say this. In one city, Ukrainian armed forces units have found themselves encircled. Yes, once again they stepped on the same rake, something they seem to do quite regularly. But let's take everything step by step. Over the past 24 hours, our troops crossed the Huliapole River at another location, and with a single rapid strike, forced the Ukrainian garrison out of the settlement of Zaporizhzhia. This is a small village located at the junction of the Pokrovsk and Zaporizhzhia regions. Despite the fact that the settlement itself is extremely small, essentially just one street, its capture is of great importance for several reasons at once. The first and most obvious reason is the western bank of the Huliapole River. Any foothold on this side of the river is critically important in terms of further westward advance. And Zaporizhzhia has now become the third settlement on the western bank of the Huliapole to come under Russian control. In other words, the bridgehead is expanding steadily and systematically. The second reason is the proximity of the next objective. West of Zaporizhzhia lies the urban-type settlement of Turnoverate, which we discussed in yesterday's episode. After crossing the river and securing control over Zaporizhzhia, Russian positions are now only about 2 kilometers away from this settlement. Let's even measure it precisely to understand the distance. So, it comes out to roughly 2.2 kilometers. That's very close. And I will repeat what I said yesterday. Turnoverate is the key point in this sector. It is not a small village, but a full-fledged urban-type settlement, located on elevated ground. In addition, a railway line passes through it, and 3 roads branch out from it, opening up opportunities for further development of the offensive. Let me once again show you the elevation map so you can clearly see the difference in terrain between Zaporizhzhia and Turnoverate. By the way, the Ukrainian command has transferred significant forces to this sector. Units such as the Da Vinci Wolves, Idar, and several other assault formations have already been spotted here. The reason for their presence is obvious, an attempt to put out the fire and stop what is being referred to as the Far Eastern Express. Nevertheless, despite this, Russian fighters continue to advance. Although yesterday I received messages from artillerymen, the commander of one artillery crew said bluntly, "There are many times more drones now. The sky is literally filthy. You can't even raise your head. When reconnaissance groups go out, they almost inevitably end up as 300s, wounded. And there are manpower problems. There aren't enough people, neither among the artillerymen nor especially in the assault units." Why am I mentioning this? To avoid unrealistic expectations. Yes, the troops are advancing. Yes, they are taking settlements. Yes, they are breaking through defensive lines. But a significant amount of Ukrainian forces has been pulled into this area, so the fighting over the next month will be difficult. One thing I am absolutely certain of is that the Vostok group will withstand the pressure and continue moving towards Zaporizhzhia. As for the high ground, you can clearly see everything yourselves. Here is Zaporizhzhia, taken yesterday, and here is Turnoverate. The difference is more than obvious. If we talk about timelines and prospects, in my opinion, Turnoverate will already be under Russian control by mid to late January. At the same time, I always try to give pessimistic forecasts to avoid disappointment later. Because if I say it will be taken in early January, and in reality it happens, say on the 12th, questions will inevitably arise. It's better to initially prepare for a longer time frame and then be pleasantly surprised if things happen faster. I think that's the right approach. Moving on. In Huliapole, the advance continues on a daily basis. I emphasize daily. Over the past 24 hours, Russian troops have taken control of Vishneva Street, along with the surrounding private housing sector. The advance through residential areas exceeded 600 meters. The actual level of control held by the Russian army in this area is even greater than what is shown on the map. I know this from reliable sources, and although I am usually cautious in my assessments, here I will allow that Huliapole may come under Russian control by the end of the year. The probability is not 100%, but it is real and fairly strong. We move on. There are also advances in the Dnipropetrovsk region, but this time in the area of responsibility of the Center Group, rather than Vostok. Russian forces managed to advance approximately 2 kilometers west of Filia. Now, to stabilize the situation, all that remains is to close the positions. The neck, there is only about 900 meters wide. There is no significant news regarding Novopavlivka. My pessimistic forecast came true. The settlement is simply too large, and it was not possible to take it in one swift push, as Russian troops attempted earlier under the cover of fog. The situation there will change fundamentally only when Russian forces begin advancing northward toward Myrnohrad. In addition, you may have already heard that the Ukrainian armed forces have begun launching attacks on Pokrovsk. In other words, they decided to demonstrate a victory, not only in Kupiansk, but here as well. However, if in Kupiansk Russian troops were vulnerable due to logistical issues, a river, supply routes under constant fire and poorly established flanks, then the situation in Pokrovsk is fundamentally different. Pokrovsk is firmly controlled by the Russian army, and any Ukrainian attacks there are outright suicide. And that is exactly how it ended. The day before yesterday, there was an attack involving 2 tanks and 2 armored combat vehicles. They attempted to break through from Hryshine toward the industrial zone, but failed. All were destroyed by Russian drone operators directly on the road. Yesterday, the Ukrainian forces tried again, once more using a tank and 3 armored vehicles. The result? The tank destroyed, 2 vehicles destroyed, and the 3rd managed to escape. You might ask, how are such attacks even possible if the road is already marked as being under Russian control on the map? That question should be directed at the cartographers. In reality, there is no stable control there. Russian forces are advancing along this road toward Hryshine, and the Ukrainian side strikes the road in an attempt to stop them. When Ukrainian forces move from Hryshine toward Pokrovsk, Russian troops strike the road and stop them. As a result, the entire route has turned into a graveyard of burned and twisted equipment, the count already reaching several dozen vehicles. That is the price of trying to secure a media victory for Zelensky. In Myrnohrad, Russian forces are gradually tightening the encirclement. The southern and northeastern parts of the city are already under Russian control. A penetration into the central part from the western direction has been recorded. Today, Russian forces took control of areas in the northwestern and southwestern parts of Myrnohrad. Video evidence confirms the advance of Russian units up to 800 meters deeper into urban development, despite counterattacks by the Ukrainian armed forces. Many military observers believe that the city will be fully taken before the end of the year. And finally, let us return to what I mentioned at the very beginning. The Ukrainian armed forces have once again found themselves encircled. This time it happened in Rodinske. Russian fighters managed to close their positions in the central part of the city, capturing 11 multi-story residential buildings. As a result, the center of Rodinske has been completely blocked, along with the Ukrainian garrison holding those buildings. Could they have withdrawn earlier? Absolutely, they could have. But they did not. As a result, they are repeating the fate of their comrades in Myrnohrad. The exact number of Ukrainian soldiers trapped there varies. I have seen estimates ranging from 120 to 500. However, 500 seems excessive for such a small area. Most likely, we are talking about 200 to 300 servicemen. What do we have at the moment? Ukrainian forces are holding a school and roughly 3 dozen apartment buildings. At the same time, they managed to slightly push Russian units out of the private housing sector on the western outskirts. Meanwhile, Russian forces in turn advanced through private residential areas in the north, along Kutuzov and Suvorov streets. Overall, the fate of Rodinske is essentially sealed, as is the fate of the Ukrainian units trapped there. They should have left the city earlier when they still had the chance. On the Vovchansk direction, fierce fighting continues in the Vovchansky-Kutory area, with no advancement by either side. Reports claiming that Prelipka has come under Russian control have not yet been confirmed. Russian attacks towards Simonivka are ongoing. An important development was the confirmation of full Russian control over the settlement of Vilcha, which has been documented on video. Previously, Ukrainian forces were actively counterattacking there in an attempt to contain the assault, but were ultimately forced to withdraw. Meanwhile, the Sumy direction is beginning to come alive at a fairly rapid and noticeable pace. Russian units are clearly undertaking something far more substantial than merely demonstrative actions aimed at rattling the Ukrainian side or drawing reserves into the area. Noticeable movements are being observed not only in the areas of Vysok and Hrabovsky. In addition, Russian forces are currently conducting assault operations in this sector, attempting to take the settlement of Ryazna. At the same time, activity is also being recorded in the areas of Oleksiivka and Yunakivka, where progress has been achieved that can be described as quite significant for the Sumy direction. The Ukrainian cartographic service Deep State has also updated its map. According to this data, Russian units have completed the clearance of Kostiantynivka and are continuing their advance toward Kondrashovka. It appears that the Russian command has decided to once again intensify combat operations specifically in this sector of the front. Thus, we are observing movement along the flanks in the Sumy area, which indicates growing activity and the potential for further developments in this direction. That concludes my overview of the current situation on the front for today. Now let us move on to the political agenda. Zelensky has once again found himself in an extremely awkward position. In his address to Ukrainians on the eve of Catholic Christmas, the former actor allowed himself to express a wish for the death of the President of Russia. As reported by the Telegram channel Legitimny, this address should be viewed exclusively through the lens of public relations. Such an inappropriate statement is a continuation of a long-used shock tactic. When, already serving as president, Zelensky inserted obscene language into his public remarks in order to be quoted, discussed, and watched. The reason is extremely simple and mundane. His addresses are barely being watched anymore, and fewer people react to their content. Sharp and scandalous remarks at least create a formal information povod for discussion. Moreover, this helps drown out negative coverage related to the failures of the so-called peace plan and the situation on the front. As a rule, such tactics are used precisely during the most difficult and crisis-ridden periods. The so-called 20 points of the peace plan that Zelensky recently presented to the public are, in essence, his personal initiative, rather than a joint position of Ukraine and the United States. Russia will never agree to such a document, and that appears to be exactly what the plan was designed for. If these points truly reflected a coordinated position between Kyiv and Washington, they would have been announced by the Americans themselves. Instead, Zelensky chose to move preemptively, deliberately injecting disinformation, thereby attempting to undermine the negotiation process while shifting the blame for its failure onto Russia. According to available information, the American side opposed this move, but it was strongly encouraged by globalist circles whose objective is to completely derail any negotiation process. There is no point in discussing these points. At the very least, the demand concerning Russian nuclear power plants is fundamentally unacceptable, as are a number of other provisions that were deliberately embedded in the document to make negotiations impossible. After Zelensky was once again provided with funding to continue the war, any talk of peace can be forgotten at least until the summer of 2026. Meanwhile, the White House has dealt a blow to so-called Euro-Atlantic unity. The United States has imposed sanctions on citizens of European countries. These measures take the form of visa restrictions against 5 Europeans, including former EU Commissioner for the Internal Market Thierry Breton. This was announced by US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. The statement notes that the State Department is taking decisive action against 5 individuals who led an organized campaign of pressure on American digital platforms with the aim of censorship, demonetization, and suppression of dissenting American views. Rubio described these individuals as radical activists and stated that their entry into, presence in, or activities within the United States could have potentially serious negative consequences for US foreign policy. He also said that the list could be expanded if other foreign actors do not change their course. At the same time, the US Department of Homeland Security has not yet provided detailed information about who exactly is affected by the sanctions. However, according to available information, the restrictions apply to Thierry Breton, who served as European Commissioner for the Internal Market from 2019 to 2024, as well as 4 representatives of non-governmental organizations that formally claim to fight disinformation and online hate speech. In particular, those affected may include Josephine Ballon and Annalena von Hodenberg from the organization Hate Aid, as well as Imran Ahmed and Claire Melville from the Center for Countering Digital Hate. In response to Marco Rubio's statement, France sharply condemned the actions of the United States. French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot stated that Paris strongly condemns the visa restrictions imposed by the United States on former Minister and Commissioner Thierry Breton, as well as 4 other prominent European figures. According to him, the peoples of Europe are free and sovereign, and no external power has the right to impose rules governing their digital space. Thierry Breton himself, in turn, described what happened as a manifestation of a McCarthyist whim. He recalled that the EU's Digital Services Act was adopted with the support of 90% of the democratically elected European Parliament, and by unanimous vote of all 27 EU member states, adding that censorship is not where many people are accustomed to looking for it. I would also remind you that the US administration has repeatedly criticized censorship practices in Europe, including in connection with the €120 million fine imposed by the European Commission on the platform X for insufficient transparency. In response, the administration of President Donald Trump threatened the European Union with retaliatory measures if it continues to restrict the activities of American technology companies.